The world's largest army gets a spending boost, but the 7% increase in Chinese military spending is the smallest for years. So what message is China sending regionally and globally, especially after Donald Trump boosted US defense spending by 10%? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. China is increasing its annual military spending by 7%, days after Donald Trump announced a 10% boost in the US defense budget. The US president has criticized China's territorial disputes with its neighbors. The Chinese government's promising to guard against what it calls outside meddling. It wants good relations with Trump administration, but will respond to any challenges.
I think fundamentally speaking, I don't know if you agree or not, the United States is probably still worried that China's capabilities might be catching up to or exceeding that of the United States. In fact, China as a developing country still has a great gap with the United States in its capabilities, but China's military development and construction is to continue. This is the requirement for the defense of our national sovereignty and security.
China's armed forces have been modernized as the Chinese economy expands. When it's formally announced on Sunday, this year's defense budget is expected to be 1.3% of GDP. That's a 7% increase on last year's budget of $146 billion. Some of that was spent building airstrips and military installations in the South China Sea, where China is involved in several territorial disputes with neighboring countries. As President Xi Jinping modernizes the army, overall troop numbers are being reduced to around 2 million. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen, who is a political and economic affairs analyst specializing in Chinese domestic and regional policy. In Washington, D.C., we have Richard Weitz, who is senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis with the Hudson Institute. And finally, Richard Bitzinger, senior fellow at Nanyang Technological University, specializing in regional military and defense issues. He joins us from Singapore. Thank you indeed, gentlemen, for joining us. Let me start by asking Mr. Einar Tangen this. Why is China reining its military spending?
Well, quite frankly, the assessment by China is not that there's going to be, there will not be a land war. And what they're signaling to the world is that they are trying to do a peaceful rise. So what you had is when Xi took over, he said he was going to reduce the army he has from 2.3 to 2 million. A lot of that has been, the savings from that has gone into upgrading the existing army and navy. And a lot of that has, because of the South China Sea, been pushed in that direction. So more aircraft carriers, submarines, and patrol boats.
Mr. Richard Weitz, is this a message that China is more in favor of diplomacy rather than chest beating in the region or globally?
I wouldn't take the defense budget announcement as a major factor in that. I mean, that's certainly been China's diplomatic statements, been the message they've been trying to communicate to the media and to Western officials. But the defense budget rise, as announced, was pretty much as expected. It represents the expected inflation rate in China plus the growth in GDP. So it's sort of what people anticipated. If it had been much more, much less, we might have been able to say it was a signal.
Mr. Bitzinger, what do you read into this announcement by the Chinese government?
Well, I think it's like what Richard Weitz said, you know, to a certain extent it's not totally unpredicted. It's pretty much keeping in line with last year's. On the other hand, the last 2 years, the increase has been the lowest in like 20 years or so. Generally, since the late 90s, you know, we've seen double-digit increases. The question is this a trend line, or are these still basically outliers?
Mr. Einar, let's look at a little bit at figures. In 2001, spending was at 54 billion. Then it skyrocketed in 2015 to 214. Is it safe to say now that because the economy is shrinking, the Chinese are saying, therefore, let's implement the same austerity measures also on the expenditure in the military?
Well, first let me respond to my colleagues. I would say that you have to look at this in the context of what the U.S. has done, putting an extra 10% on and being very bellicose about being number one in nuclear arms, being on top of the world, this type of thing. In many cases, this would have merited some extra consideration by China to say, look, we're going to keep up with you. But they did not take that bait. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to say, well, it was expected, nothing is. Actually, at this point in time, with Trump in control of the United States, or at least trying to be in control, it is unpredictable. No one knows exactly what he's going to do. So in this particular context, I think you have to give some credit to China that they haven't, as I said, taken the bait.
Mr. Weitz, how do you respond to what Mr. Tangen was saying? Basically about the fact that Trump expands, the Chinese are saying we will give more wisdom to that.
Well, I mean, the thing about the U.S. Policy, I mean, President Trump has announced a proposed defense budget. So he's going to propose to the Congress in next month, whenever he submits the budget, that we increase the U.S. defense budget. But of course, Congress itself decides how much would actually be increased and where that money would go. And so you could take the Chinese maneuver as possibly an effort to try and discourage that increase in defense spending, or as a signal that China is not concerned, or as an effort, an olive branch. I mean, it's just a little unclear yet, since, as our colleague in Beijing pointed out, the U.S. policy towards many issues, including China, is unclear, just because we're getting different messages from different people, and the administration still hasn't conducted its policy reviews or even appointed many of the mid-level people. So it's a bit premature to know how the Chinese are reading that. But certainly one of their options could have been to say, we will not be intimidated, we're going to increase our budget by more, but they did not do that.
Mr. Bitzinger, could this possibly be a message that China is willing to maintain very good relations with the Trump administration for the coming years?
Well, first of all, I respectfully would disagree with some of the things that were said. I don't know if there's much of a linkage between what the Chinese are saying with their increase and what Trump is saying with his increase. This was probably a decision made a long time ago inside the innermost circles of the Communist Party, that this was driven more by domestic and particularly domestic economic reasons. They're happy to sort of get the inference that others are making that somehow they don't want to ratchet up tensions. They're probably still playing pretty much a wait-and-see game with Trump. And there's probably also a feeling that the last thing they want to do is, figuratively poke that bear.
Mr. Einar, the Chinese government has voiced concerns about the last meeting between Trump and Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, also the phone call conversation with the Taiwanese leader. Against the backdrop of this strained relationship, don't you think that the military-industrial complex, or the Chinese people in general, would be somehow concerned that while the Americans are putting more money into military spending, the Chinese are trying to put more austerity on the spending?
Well, I mean, you're talking about a couple of different issues. The U.S. expanding or at least as was pointed out, the proposed idea that the U.S. will be expanding both its nuclear arsenal and its conventional forces and replacing everything is one thing. Japan is an entirely different thing. Obviously, there's a lot of sensitivity in China over the island dispute, and also the behavior of Japan in terms of acknowledging its wartime atrocities here. And that's not only shared in China, but it's also in South Korea. So against this particular backdrop, with Japan trying to normalize its country, getting back to what they think they should be, and abandoning this kind of peace, let's say, non-aggressive, peacetime constitutional requirement, this has all been kind of an excuse, to put it in a bad pun, trumped up. So in terms of Japan, you should perhaps treat that a little bit separately. I think it continues to be an irritant in the East China Seas. I think that plays into what the U.S. wants in terms of keeping China busy. In terms of the overall thing with the U.S., I think Trump has deliberately stated to the world that he's going to put security assurances on the same table as he puts his trade negotiations. So this kind of his idea of the world is like a bicycle wheel, with the U.S. at the hub and with bilateral relations with each individual country. The difference is that he intends to use, as I said, security issues as part of that negotiation.
Richard Weitz, Trump as a candidate during the campaign, he was known for his anti-China campaign. Now in power, do you believe that we are bracing for some sort of Sino-American collision in the near future, or do you think that other considerations will be taken into account?
Well, in assessing the administration's policies, insofar as I can determine them so far, their immediate concern is ISIS and terrorism, but their long-range security concern is indeed China. They consider China the main long-term challenger to the United States economically and militarily, and many of their policies, insofar as they reflect the president's preferences, will probably be shaped to that end. And I think that's one reason I've been told they're so eager to improve relations with Russia, is they want to try and weaken the Russia-China relationship, which also covers this dimension, because the Russians supply China with some of their advanced weapon systems, which are often, by the way, not included in the budget. But long term, I think we may well see a clash between China and the United States under the Trump administration over some issues beyond trade, some security issues. Still unclear where, since Taiwan would have been an obvious one, but they backed out on that. Japan, unclear yet, South China Sea. But certainly, if you talk to the people they've had so far in the Trump administration, China is their main long-term concern.
Mr. Bitzinger, do you think that because the two countries, China and the United States of America, are major trading partners, economy could become an element that would push the two countries for further cooperation instead of a standoff in the near future?
Well, certainly it makes it different than the U.S.-Soviet relationship during the Cold War. I mean, essentially, trade was essentially limited to the U.S. selling the Soviets wheat and the Soviets basically giving us vodka. There's obviously a much more intertwined economic relationship. In general, China is much more entangled, happily so, I'd say, in the global economic structure. And those are mitigating circumstances, certainly. One of the things that bothers me, though, is you've got two countries which are essentially being led by elites that see themselves as victims. China's long played this kind of political card of being a great country, but hemmed in and contained by outside powers. And now you have Trump, who essentially is someone who says that America's been the world's sucker for too long. And what I worry is that these types of more ego kind of driven concerns about, you know, we're the victim, you should concede to us, is something that could actually make relations more difficult and perhaps more tense.
China's military buildup in the South China Sea is alarming the neighbors. Brunei, China, Japan, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan and Vietnam all have competing territorial disputes, especially over the sovereignty of two chains of islands, the Paracels and the Spratlys. Photos published late last year revealed artificial islands with airstrips built on reefs. Chinese leaders say they have no intention of militarizing the islands, but acknowledge building necessary military facilities for defensive purposes. Mr. Einar, what kind of message will China now be sending to its neighbors with whom it has huge territorial disputes?
Well, by cutting back on its defense spending, it's signaling that it's not anticipating to do this, but to do anything active. But the fact is, China is putting together a fleet of its own aircraft carriers, and it is putting defensive mechanisms on these islands. China feels that it needs to do this, and I would point to my previous colleague who mentioned that you have two countries who feel that they're being victimized. But the freedom of navigation patrols that are being mounted by the U.S. are seen as very provocative in China. It is not seen as something that is friendly. There's this idea that the U.S., through Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, has in essence been trying to hem in China, much to contain it in terms of its global economic footprint and to prevent it from developing spheres of influence. So in this particular case, yes, these ASEAN nations are concerned. I think the Philippines has taken a slightly different tact in terms of recognizing the reality. But given what Trump represents in the world today, I don't know that they would be willing to bet the whole farm on the U.S. relationship. So this is what is happening here today. Uncertainty.
Let me go to Mr. Weitz. Mr. Weitz, we have potential for a standoff in the particularly East China Sea and South China Sea. The reduced military ambition as portrayed by the 7% increase which is being seen as modest, is it going to be seen as a sign by all those countries that China is going to pursue less assertive, less aggressive approach in the region?
The challenge that faces these countries, as well as the United States, and we haven't found a good answer to this, is not so much military. What the Chinese have cleverly been doing is a form of what the Russians are supposedly doing under this hybrid warfare technique. That is, what the Chinese are doing is not making overt military maneuvers to seize disputed territories or intimidate countries. They're actually using paramilitary forces, diplomacy, law, etc., to extend their influence. So it's not as if they're directly making a military challenge that might trigger a U.S. military response. It's more these kind of gray zone activities, declaring an air identification zone or building their new islands and then deploying systems on that. And so it's really difficult for example, the U.S. to say, well, this is a military threat, we're going to respond by sending in the Marines, or for the Japanese to do likewise. It's a very sophisticated strategy of extending China's influence without using overt military tools, but with having the military in the background to provide, just to let people know that over time this is going to be more of an issue.
All right, in this
so I'm not sure if the military budget itself is going to influence this immediately. It's more how China behaves in the sub-conventional zone.
Okay, so let's take some cases, for example, just to further illustrate the potential for more conflict. Mr. Bitzinger, Japan and China both identify the East China Sea as air defense identification zones. And would the 7% spending be seen by Japan as a sign that China is going to further de-escalate in this region?
De-escalate or escalate?
De-escalate.
Well, I don't think you can infer that. Keep in mind, this is not a defense cut. This is a defense increase of only 7%. Most militaries around the world would love to have only a 7% increase in their defense. So we have to keep the context in mind. This is not China pulling back from its commitments to build up its military and to make it a more credible, modern force. This is perhaps at most a temporary lull, or perhaps a slowing or something like that. Between China and Japan, there's a very obvious competition going on. It's becoming more overt. It's playing out in the East China Sea, as you say. I don't think that's going to go away.
Okay.
This is one reason. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, okay. Mr. Einar, the China outspent Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Vietnam combined. So for many, this is still a sign that the Chinese government are definitely willing to continue their aggressive military approach in the region.
Are you saying that China is, first off, I'd like to make 2 points. The characterization of what China is doing in all of these theaters is that they're somehow being sneaky and doing something that's
no,
untoward.
but we're just talking against
how would
the
you characterize the U.S.?
Yeah, it was just because we're talking against the backdrop of a geostrategic area where you have the potential for conflict. We're talking about disputed territories and water. So the potential for a confrontation or a military confrontation has been always described as very high.
It is very high, and in particular, the recent statement, on one hand, you had Trump saying, I adhere to the one China principle, and then he sent his Secretary of State over to Japan and said, look, we will respond and protect your interests in the East China Seas over these disputed islands. Now, if you go back into history, what these islands were they were not given to Japan. They are not acknowledged either by the U.S. or any international court as part of Japan. They're given there to be administered by them until such time as their property interests were determined. So the U.S. going forward with this type of declaration is very provocative. And this is where I would expect, if there's going to be a provocation, if there's going to be an incident, that it'll probably things. Japan seems intent on following the U.S. in harassing China. And in China, I think, will respond. And I don't think it's a good thing, but it's quite probable.
Let's inform Mr. Weitz. Mr. Weitz, China is reported to have asked companies to impose sanctions on South Korea because of the willing to host the THAAD defense missile system. So aren't we still within the narrative of a potential confrontation in the region?
Well, the South Korea THAAD issue is actually very interesting. You've got this very unfortunate dynamic in which I have a little sympathy for China in the sense that there's no easy solution to this one, is that they've got a very disruptive, aggressive neighbor in the north, launching missiles, testing nuclear weapons. And what that does is it triggers Japan, South Korea, and the United States to respond by, among other means, building up their missile defenses. And these missile defenses can't really affect China, despite what the Chinese say. I mean, they're just not sufficiently robust and extensive enough to affect China's nuclear deterrent. But like the Russians, the Chinese have chosen to describe this as a threat, and so they're taking a response, which so far has not been overtly military. It's more been, as you said, in threatening the South Korean companies with loss of business, cutting back on tourist ties, describing this as an unfriendly diplomatic act. It's less bellicose than the Russians have been acting in Eastern Europe, but it's still the same kind of concern. And so this one, though, I think can be addressed through diplomacy, confidence-building measures, and especially especially addressing. It's like we all have a common problem in North Korea. I actually am more concerned about some of the other issues we talked about, such as the East and South China Seas.
Okay, Mr. Bitzinger, because the economy has been shrinking, people would just try to connect the dots and say that the Chinese are putting more austerity on the spending. But what if the economy rebounds? Do you expect more spending in the near future?
Oh, yeah, I do. I think that the Chinese leadership has made a long-term commitment to modernizing the Chinese military. This is evident in all their white papers. They see China by the middle of this century becoming a modern industrial power, and they want to have the military might that goes with it. Again, this isn't a defense cut. This is just simply a slackening, probably a temporary one in the defense expenditures, and that I do anticipate seeing a rebound, most likely when the economy comes back. But again, next year there could be a different story, and they could be increasing defense despite an economic slowdown.
Well, gentlemen, unfortunately we're out of time, and unfortunately we won't be able to continue this conversation, but looking forward to seeing you in the near future to continue our debate about China's military spending. Mr. Einar Tangen, Richard Weitz and Richard Bitzinger, thank you very much indeed. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.